Tom is going to do the opening remarks for us. So thank you.
You're welcome. Good morning, or afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is certainly a pleasure to represent the best district in the world and to work in probably the best region in the world. And I really think that we are all blessed to be living in this community. I am the superintendent, as you heard, and I think that today we have a unique opportunity. Today, we're going to review some results of what the community looks like from children's perspectives. I hope that as you see the data, and as we continue to talk about that data, that together we will find an openness and a willingness to work together to solve any problems that we articulate that get in the way of those wonderful children becoming the leaders of tomorrow's community. And so with that, I thank you very much and would like to turn over the afternoon to a couple of pretty phenomenal people who have done some great work in the community. You all know, I think, Kim Schonert-Reichl and Martin Guhn. We were going to read your entire bio, but I figured I would just say that you're wonderful folks and you have some terrific information that we need to look at. So welcome to all of you. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you, Tom.
I want to thank you once again all for coming and joining us in our call to action. Kim Schonert-Reichl and the whole team at the Human Early Learning Partnership, we've been working for many years to come to situations like this where we can share our data with a group like you, because at the end of the day, we hope that the research we produce can inform those who make a difference for children and their families. So this is absolutely fabulous to see the turnout and you joining us in our call to action. The title of our talk is Early and Middle Childhood, a call to action. I will speak about early childhood and EDI data first, and then Kim will talk about the middle years. Before I start with talking about some of the more specific data, I'd like to frame it by talking about why do we need data, because there are very different perceptions of why we need research data. And there's one slogan we have sometimes used: no data, no problem, no action. And I think many of you can relate to it. Unless you have information on something, there's not an issue, and you maybe feel less compelled to act and to change things. But of course, we have to realize data can do a lot of different things. And I think that's important to realize, because when we talk to communities, sometimes people, oh, why do we need the research? We knew this already. But there are other situations where, so sometimes data does really confirm some of the assumptions we're already having. But that's good, because it can back up our arguments. Then sometimes it questions certain beliefs we already hold, because it conflicts what we believe, and then we have reasons for starting discussions. It raises questions. And then finally, if the data we see conflicts with what we believe in and is different from the situation we want to see, then it can motivate us to act and to change. So what we're doing today is we'll present data, but we really consider this a starting point for a discussion, and then hopefully for something that will spur collaboration and action for supporting children and families. We set the talk up so we have two parallel sections. I will first talk about the importance of early childhood, and then what the EDI is, the Early Development Instrument, and why it is important. And then I will present just a little teaser of the Coquitlam data from the EDI. And then the second part, Kim will do the exact same thing for the middle years development instruments. She will first of all talk about the importance of middle childhood, what the MDI is, and why it's important, and then finally give you some data from our last year's data collection effort here in Coquitlam. Because many of you are familiar with some of the EDI data, I'll focus on some of the latest highlights, but Kim will be going into somewhat more detail when it comes to the MDI. The importance of early childhood. One thing is important to say in regard to different developmental periods is that they're all important in their own right. But of course, different things happen at different times. So brain development and how brain connections are formed during the early years sets the foundation for a lot of other things that happen later in life. But it's important to look at development maybe in two ways. First of all, we have to look at each developmental period in its own right, but then we also have to make connections between what happens early in life and later on in life, and also how what happens to a child and its own developmental trajectory, how that relates to the context, the social context, the demographic context in which children are living. One framework that we have been using for years and that Clyde Hertzman has expanded, it's taken from Yuri Bronfenbrenner's work. We have found quite successful to communicate the concept or the theoretical framework we use when thinking about children's development. One thing is important to say about child development. Jack Shankoff, I think, captured very well in a quote. He once said, "Child development is not rocket science. It's much more complicated than that." And I think when I go through the next following slides, you'll get a sense of why he said that and why that really is the case. So when you think about child development, what we have to understand are, what do the children themselves bring to the situation? What kind of personal characteristics do they have? What biological characteristics? What social competences and so forth? And then of course these things happen and change and occur over time. So you see a little toddler here and going all the way through early adolescence. But then there are a lot of other things in the environment that influence the children. And that can be the family context, so parenting, whether parents or caregivers love their children, whether they read to them, whether they play with them, that's hugely important for development. But then there are other influences at the neighborhood level or the residential area. But we can also think about neighborhood and community in two different ways. You can think about community in a geographical, spatial sense, all the people who live around you. But you can also think about community in a relational sense. Relatives that live in Toronto or on the East Coast, they have a strong influence on your life and on your relationship building, a lot of other aspects of your life, but they may not be living close to you. So I think it's important to think of community in both the spatial and in the relational sense. Then, of course, there are all these early child development programs and services and all kinds of other programs for after school, for older children, of course, for families themselves to support them. And the regional influences that could be cultural, they could be political, they could be legal, they all have an influence on children's development. And what's important to notice is that these influences may not always directly influence a child, but indirectly. So for example, if there are certain childcare policies or tax reductions in place, they may affect the parents, but then because they affect the parents' lives and their stress levels, then indirectly that will affect the children because they interact daily with their children. And then finally, there are national and even global factors that can indirectly influence how children develop. So this is just to set a framework of the complexity we have to deal with to really understand how children develop, and then to unpack it piece by piece and take a closer look at different individual developmental outcomes at different stages in children's life. So with that framework, I'd now like to turn our attention to the EDI and zoom in on the early childhood period. So now we'll be talking about kindergarten children who will be about age 5 old, and Kim will later be focusing on the middle childhood period. So what is the early development instrument, or EDI, and why is it important? Just by a show of hands, who has heard of the EDI? Okay, that's what I expected. Okay, that's great. I'll say these few things or remind you of those because it will be important to contrast with the MDI later on, and to what extent these two measures are similar, but also to what extent they're different. So the early development instrument is a population-based measure. This is quite unique. We're really capturing 80 or 90% of all the children. So I think that's part of its powerfulness. It speaks to people because everybody can relate to it. It's about all of our children in a given neighborhood. It's about kindergarten students, and it's filled out by teachers. And there are 5 domains, developmental domains, that are part of the EDI. There's social competence, emotional maturity, language and cognitive development, communication skills, and physical health and well-being. And what's important about this is that this represents a holistic approach to looking at child development. Often you have indicators and they just look at one aspect, for example, physical health, or they will just look at educational outcomes. So here, the EDI has always been trying to capture children's development holistically. And here's some of the latest Coquitlam EDI results. This is from the 2010-2011 school year. And before I show you a couple of the maps and graphs, I want to say that all the information we're showing, and we're just giving you a teaser, is also on the HELP website. And you also have, from what I've heard, some of the fact sheets on your tables. So the fact that we'll be going through quickly here is that you all have access, and we'll also have time later for asking questions in case you want to get more detail. I'll give you a little overview of what we found for the latest wave of EDI data. This is wave 4 EDI data. And this map represents the percent of children who were considered vulnerable on one or more of the 5 EDI domain scales. So what does this mean? We have 5 domains on the EDI, and for every domain on the EDI there's a cutoff, and if you're below a certain cutoff, then you get this label, you're vulnerable. And if a child is vulnerable on any of these 5 scales, then they're considered vulnerable on one or more of the 5 scales. And then most of you have seen maps. So I think what's powerful about these maps is that they show you very quickly that there's huge geographical variation. And so that's interesting in itself, because people can zoom in on their own neighborhood and kind of situate their own neighborhood in relationship to all the neighborhoods around them, but not just at a regional level for Coquitlam, but you can actually do that for the entire province of BC. And within the next couple of years, you may even be able to do that for several other provinces. One thing I'd like to spend a couple of minutes on is the trends that we have observed over the last few years, because it's really the most exciting finding insofar as we have now been collecting data for quite a while, and we can actually look at trends over time. So what you here see is data from wave 2, wave 3, and wave 4. So this represents data collection from over several years. And what you see overall is that vulnerability on one or more scales went up from about 23% to about 33%. So an increase by about 10%. Sometimes we also present the similar data by taking out the communication scale, because communication often captures children who have English as a second language, so we sometimes take it out, but you see the same trend. But once you look at the individual domains of the EDI, there's a really more differentiated picture. For example, you see that communication skills, the vulnerability level almost exactly the same, a flat line. And the question is, we can only see this pattern in the data, but we can't tell you, we can't explain just from the data itself why that is the case. And that's why these collaborations and these discussions are so important. There's one domain that's also interesting, and that's the social competence domain, which was at a fairly low overall vulnerability rate level for wave 2, but increased much quicker and to a much higher point than all the other domains. And so then the question is there something different happening in Coquitlam with regard to how children develop socially as compared to in the other domains? I'm just checking with time.
I think you're doing well.
Okay. If there are any clarification questions, okay. When Angelo, Kim, Susan, and I prepared this talk, one of the things that we wanted to do at the end of the talk is that they will talk about initiatives that have been happening in Coquitlam, and then to see if we can make sense of what has happened in your neighborhoods, to what extent it may relate to the trends we're seeing. What I should also be saying is that this general trend in increasing vulnerability we have seen across the entire province of BC. So overall, vulnerability went up. And so in light of the data that Susan and Angelo presented at the beginning, that is converging information. Things have become a little harder for families, and wait for Kim's talk to see to what extent the information she will present will also converge with what we're seeing from the EDI data. I will give you some more information on the social competence domain, because if we think about these 5 domains, they're really 5 fairly broad and somewhat abstract constructs. It's hard for those who work on the ground to do something about social competence or physical health and well-being without knowing some more differentiated, detailed information of what goes into that domain. And I'm not sure of how many of you have actually seen the EDI. Are there some kindergarten teachers who have filled out the EDI in there? Okay, so none of you. So usually when we talk to audiences, we find that many have not seen the actual items or questions that are on the EDI. And so just to give you an example, an idea, I listed all the ones that are on the social competence domain, and I grouped them according to 4 different categories. So here on the left, you see overall social competence. And this really relates to questions that ask of whether the children get along with peers and with other people. And then there's another category, respect and responsibility, whether they respect adults, other children, whether they follow rules and so forth. And then there's the social interaction between the teacher and the children in terms of the more formal classroom. Do they follow rules? Do they complete work on time? Do they listen? Do they follow directions and so forth? And then finally here you see a domain called readiness to explore new things. This relates to whether children are curious to engage in new things, whether it's a new toy, a new game, or a new book. So you see that within the social competence domain, that overall broad construct, there's quite a variety of questions captured in there. And I think when it comes to action and thinking about what's really happening, it's important to know what the questions are that lead to the ratings that teachers actually make on the EDI. And with that, I'll turn it over to Kim.
Hi. How are you feeling? Well, I'm Kimberly Schonert-Reichl, and I study social and emotional learning. So that's why I have to start by asking you how you're feeling. Sorry about that. I'll stay away from the speakers. And one of the things that I just wanted to start off by saying, so I have tell you a little bit about my trajectory. Started off as a teacher. How many of you are teachers in here? Are there any teachers? Started off as a teacher, elementary school, 7th, 8th grade, high school. Then I went back and got my PhD, became a developmental psychologist. Then I went and became a professor, and then I became a parent. And I studied, 12 years of post, high school, university, and it wasn't really till I had kids that I understood, or really, but I realized what I don't know about child development. So I will tell you a bit about, for a while I did research on the Roots of Empathy program. Does anyone know Roots of Empathy? So I've done research across that for about 10 years. And I've been doing research on middle childhood. I will tell you something. I have, is that making too much noise? You guys don't think that? Or is it? I'm just worried about, okay, how's that? Better? Okay, better for me. I now have a son who just turned 12 last week, and one who's 15. So are you starting to think that maybe I'll start, after middle childhood, we'll start hearing about the adolescent development instrument? What do you think? So as you can see, this all links back to kind of my own experiences. And really my own curiosity about what is it about, what really is going to be the best thing we can do to help children thrive and be the best they can be, and what role do we play as parents, as community members, and when we know the information, I actually think it's unethical for us not to do something. So I will tell you, we are presenting you the data, which means that really we have to do something, because you can't stick your head in the sand once you know the facts. That's how I see it. So I'm going to be talking about the importance of middle childhood, What is the MDI and why is it important? And finally, some of the Coquitlam MDI results. One thing I want to start off with talking about the importance of middle childhood, that we know that the ages 6 to 12 is an important developmental phase. We know for many reasons. There's many cognitive changes. Think of a 6-year-old and think of a 12-year-old. Think of the difference between those age groups, having so many cognitive changes, social changes. They start after they're in kindergarten. The influence of outside their family plays such a big role in their development and all the things they can do. So we know middle childhood, and looking at this timeline of development, I do have to tell you in terms of the research that there's been a lot of research in the past decade or more on early childhood. How many of you have ever heard about the importance of brain development in early childhood? Right? We know that. That's such an important factor now. And yet middle childhood is still an area we don't know as much about. People have sort of studied a lot about early childhood, and then adolescence, and usually they study adolescence because what happens in adolescence? Lots of problems, lots of things that we have to repair. And what we know now is that in middle childhood, if you actually address some of these issues that might be bubbling up to the surface, you could actually prevent a lot of the problems that happen in adolescence. And that's what's so critical. I'll be talking about it with the MDI. We know there's things such as poverty, increasing poverty, which Angelo made a good case in terms of what's happening. I think it's 1 in 5 in BC, or is it 1 in 6 now? 1 in 5, okay. The loss of support, we think about the loss of support both in terms of the two parent working families, the loss of support in the neighborhood, in terms of the loss of the extended families and the communities. Back in my day, we used to have, the neighbors raised you. I'd come home from school, my mom would have have a snack. I'd watch Gilligan's Island, and then, right? And then I'd go down the street and play with Diane, and we'd write a play, and my mom would come then to the driveway when it was dinner time. Kim, call me, and everybody would say, "Oh, Kim, your mom's calling you." But it's no longer the case of that. We know there's increasing exposure to violence. I don't know, any of you have adolescent boys at home? Have you heard of Xbox? Call of Duty? Anyway, I just have to say, the increased exposure of violence through video games, just through media, just through on the computer and what you can Google on YouTube. Just constant, and we do know, just so you know, I will tell you as a developmental psychologist, the research is clear that continued exposure to violence via violent video games does lead to a numbing of and a decrease in empathy. Like the research is clear that that's what happens. We know there's increased bullying and victimization. Things like relational aggression, where they do this more social exclusion. We know it actually starts before kindergarten, where they start doing this relational aggression. And we also know mental health. 1 in 5 children during the elementary school years have a diagnosable mental health disorder. And only about 25% of them receive the help they need. So there's a huge burden that's now occurring to our children, and things that we really have to address now. So one of the things that's so important is thinking about the whole child in multiple contexts. And there's really a whole movement now about the whole child and thinking about all the different dimensions of the child, from their social and emotional, their physical well-being, till their academic well-being. And we know that we need to address all of these dimensions to help children thrive and grow. We also know, now one of the things that we're finding more and more is that we need to listen to the perspectives of children, to hear what they say with their voice. And you know what? Children as young as preschool can tell us what they think about things. I read about a really interesting study several years ago, in which they wanted to know about a program in a preschool and what the kids thought of it. And they thought, how many of you work with preschoolers? Or been around? Okay, some of you do. They actually found that they gave them little cameras, those disposable cameras, and had them go around and take pictures of their favorite things. And then they took the pictures and had discussions with the kids to say, why did you take this picture? It was quite a fascinating thing. And what we know is that there can be lots of things that they do with the perspectives of children. Sorry, still feel like I'm getting too much feedback here. And then finally, we know relationships are central. for years, one of the questions I've had and throughout my research is something called resiliency. How many of you have heard that term, resiliency? Oh, great. It's a wonderful term. And the idea of how do you make it despite the odds against you? And you know what one of the single most important factors in resiliency, actually 5 decades of research on resiliency, came up with one thing: relationships. Relationships are central, both in promoting risk. If you have an early poor relationship early on, poor attachment, it can set the stage for many, many problems. But if you have that one significant adult, it could be a parent, it could be another caregiver, it could be an adult in the neighborhood, that is really one of the most critical factors for promoting resiliency in children. And I'll talk more about that when we get to the MDI results. Going to this, I'm going to start with a metaphor, and I'm going to use it throughout when I talk about the MDI results, the richness of the soil. So when you think of resiliency, it's really about the nutrients that are in a child's life that help them be resilient. What are the factors that are actually nourish them, help them thrive? And we know that there's things in their environment, significant adults, positive peer relationships, developing a sense of their own efficacy or empowerment, all of those things. And we call that the richness of the soil because they're in the context. They're not just within the child. They're things that we can provide. So I'm going to start with this metaphor and I'll revisit it. But think again of this idea of the richness of the soil, of the environment. So one of the things I do want to give you one example. So for example, in Boston, they decided as a whole city that they needed to address the after-school hours. There's research on the after-school time. I don't know how many of you have heard of the importance of after-school hours. That in the States, there's this organization, in fact, they did research on the juvenile crime, and they found that juvenile crime was the highest between the hours of 3 to 7. And and hospital room emergency visits by young adolescents, right? They're home by themselves. And so the city of Boston decided to get together with a number of business partners and the mayor, and they raised $35 million so that they could create this organization called After School and Beyond to create after-school programs for every child. So I thought that was quite fascinating. And this mayor just really says our young people deserve no less attention than that, of the importance of that, of after-school time. And this gets back to this idea of the importance of everyone. I'm getting back to Yuri. That Yuri Bronfenbrenner was really a smart guy. Besides the ecological context, he also talked about, this is one of my favorite quotes, that every child requires someone in his or her life who's absolutely crazy about them. So what is the MDI? The MDI, like the EDI, the MDI now is the middle years development instrument, and you're going to be hearing in a few years about the ADI, or Adolescent Development Instrument. And why is it important? So why would we care about looking at middle childhood? There's our logo. So again, as Martin said, like the EDI, it's a population-based measure, which means all of the children take it, not just a random sample of children, but all of children. And we're really able to get a sense of all of the children in the community. It's grade 4 students who are 10-year-olds. And it's really important. There's many reasons I'll get to why we think grade 4 is the age. It's a self-report survey, which means that children complete the survey versus teachers. For the EDI, teachers complete the survey. For this, the children actually complete the survey. And I'll tell you a little bit more about why we have that. And there's 5 critical components. There's social and emotional development, connectedness with families, schools, neighborhoods, and peers, school experiences, including their sense of school climate, their connectedness to their school, as well as bullying and victimization. There's physical health and well-being that includes how many nights a week they eat meals with their family, and what time they go to sleep at night, or how many nights they get a good sleep. And also constructive use of after-school time, what they do after school, where they go, and not just that, but what they wish they could do after school. Now this, I have to say, isn't it interesting to me when we did this first research, that when you think about after school time, there was no research whatsoever that actually went to kids and asked them what they wish to do during the after school hours. Isn't that just funny? Like, I just found that so interesting. So we know why 4th grade. What we know about 4th grade is an important transitional time in development. It's right on the cusp of early adolescence. It's right at the time where there's physical, cognitive, social, emotional changes happening, but it's also at a time where you really could intervene on these windows of development. If you really want to make a difference and really get the most bang for your buck, so to speak, it's going for those transitional periods in development. Kindergarten is one, grade 4 is another development, important transitional phase. We know that's the age they can actually complete a self-report survey on their own, well, with the teacher reading out loud, but they can actually answer the responses in a reliable, valid way, and that we can get consistent responses. It also is a target for prevention. Again, if you really want to target and prevent mental health problems, it's right at the age, right when sort of anxiety and different kinds of problems start bubbling up to the surface. So we also know, well, why would we ask kids? Why would we actually go to the kids? Why don't we just have the teachers fill out the surveys on the kid at 4th grade? What we know is, have you heard of the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child? Right, that? Well, we know with Article 12 that children have a right to give their opinion and be listened to by the adults around them. And this is a way for us to really listen to what the kids say about their life. If we want to know how they feel, if we want to know about their own sense of well-being and how connected they are to their neighbors and to their families and to their schools, we would just be guessing if we were adults. You know, we might kind of have an idea, but across all areas of their life, we really need to ask them. So here's some Coquitlam results. Okay, so, oh, sorry, I'm going too fast. So the data were collected in March 2011, so a year ago, a little less than a year ago. That's a picture of the survey that the children get, that the teachers, I'm so sorry for the back, I don't know, I think if I move away, I'm trying to figure out if I'm just too close. Okay, thank you. Is that better? How, can you hear me still? Yeah. Okay, good. Okay, good. Thank you, thank you. We know 88% of grade 4 children in Coquitlam participated. So 88% of the children were part of the survey, 1,921 students, and 100% of Coquitlam schools participated. So, so thank you to all the teachers and all of the people who made it happen, because it was a big effort to actually collect all those data from the children. On your table, you actually have the community summary that talks about the MDI results. It looks like that. And then if you go to the, thank you, Jennifer. And if you go to the Human Early Learning Partnership website, you can download all the maps. So what I'm going to do now is I just am giving you the tapas version of the maps, but you can get all of the maps on, so tapas, you know, like eating tapas. Okay, like just having little tastes and stuff, and so you can go for the full mapping on the website. So there's, when we look, so what we do first is we create an index of well-being. So let me just tell you a little bit about what's different between the EDI and the MDI. How many of you, I didn't even ask you, how many of you have heard of the MDI? Oh, some of you did. Okay, and much more than I thought. Is that we created an index of well-being that used some dimensions on the measure. So I will say, so one of the areas that it's interesting that you highlighted, Martin, the social competence area, and that really, my area of expertise is really social and emotional learning, or social emotional competence, and also positive development. So we included in our dimensions of well-being not just an absence of ill-being, but really what are the factors we know that help children thrive. And we know optimism. You know, some of you might know there's a whole research on positive psychology and looking at optimism, promoting optimism. There's even a book called Learned Optimism. And we know that people who are optimistic, who actually see the glass half full, who look on the positive side of things, that they actually live longer. And you know, they live longer, they have better relationships, they have better job satisfaction than people who are see reality, really. So those people who are somewhat delusional, bottom line, it's good. So I know, it's sort of, you know, it's an interesting concept. So, and happiness, we know people are happy. There's so many things about happiness. And I do want to, you know, one little aside, is so interesting to me in psychology, you know, having studied this for a few decades, isn't until about a decade ago that they started studying that sort of positive side of well-being. Because what I read was after World War II, when psychology was really developing, was they started wanting to study, depression and post-traumatic stress disorder after the veterans were coming back. And so the 5 decades, they really focused on trying to figure out depression and anxiety. And it wasn't until about early 2000, Mike Csikszentmihalyi and Marty Seligman started going like, we don't know anything about joy. We don't, you know what? Another area we know very little about, hope. How hope develops, this whole construct. Anyway, so we included some of these dimensions, never before included in a dimension of well-being. We looked at self-esteem, general health, and also sadness. So what I'm first going to present to you is in Coquitlam, the number of children, we did 3 dimensions. Thriving, how many were doing above the expected. Really, what if we use this composite, how many were doing really thriving, how many were doing well, and how many were below the expected. So what we find in Coquitlam overall, 51% of children are thriving, are doing on all these, a composite of all these dimensions, doing above, doing really reaching high. 23% are medium well-being, and then finally 27% are of this lower well-being on a composite of those 5 dimensions. The next one we're going to is, so if we actually look at, so now I'm bringing you to the neighborhoods. So you guys probably know these neighborhoods better than I do. Mm-hmm. So what you can do is you can look at these neighborhoods, and on each one, it has a circle of, the green is what? Remember the thriving? The yellow is the medium to well-being, and then this one is the low. So I'm going to just let you take that in for a second. They're all kind of looking at your neighborhoods, but I'm going to point you out to a couple of things. So look at Sun Valley. How many of you know Sun Valley? Oh, there you go. How about Citadel Heights, Kilmer Park, and Central Mary Hill? Okay. So those are ones you see here. Sun Valley, a large percent are thriving, majority. I mean, all 3, it's a majority. Citadel Heights, it's more than half, but they have a pretty large red slice. And then Central Mary Hill is a large thriving. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you social class. So I'm now talking about, these are the neighborhoods, and the darker blue is the highest social class, so socioeconomic status. The medium blue is the medium, and the light one is the lowest in terms of it would be higher poverty or higher, right? So you got that? Now I'm going to put the 2 together. The number of kids who are thriving with the socioeconomic status. And what you see now, interestingly, Citadel Heights, which would have a high social class, actually their amount of kids thriving isn't as much as in Central Mary Hill, which is a lower SES. Now for me, I'm so curious. Why? Why is that? Why would that be? What's happening in those different areas? Even Sun Valley, which is in the middle of the road. Or you look at places like Coquitlam, or you look up at Anmore Pleasantside, Heritage Mountain. There are some people out here. And you look at the number of kids thriving. The one thing that really I first see, besides these differences, or what we call off diagonals, is that in every single section, no matter how high the SES is, the social class, there's a number of kids who aren't doing well. On this dimension of well-being. But remember, we're looking at not, well, actually it's across many things, but we're looking at their social and emotional well-being. We're looking at how they are in terms of optimism and happiness and self-esteem. So that's one thing to look at. But now I'm going to take one thing that's different about the MDI is that we not only looked at how well kids were doing on the social, emotional well-being and things, that we actually then looked at assets. And do you remember the soil? How many of you remember me talking about the soil? Told you I'd come back here. Highest, really deep, dark soil. But does that help? The deep, dark soil helps people grow, right? So the assets, we looked at 4 kinds of assets. Positive adult relationships. So did the children have a positive adult relationship at school, at home, in their neighborhood? Did children have positive peer relationships, a sense of connection to their peers? Did they have after-school activities, constructive use of time after school? And finally, nutrition and sleep. And in nutrition and sleep, very interestingly, we had 3 dimensions that we looked at. Did they, at least three times, to be high, to be the deep, dark brown, rich soil, you had to have dinner, at least a mealtime, at least 3 times a week with an adult member of the family. You had to have a good sleep at least 3 days a week, and you had to have breakfast 3 times a week. That's what went into that measure, okay? So here, when I go to these next maps, if every community now has a puzzle piece of assets. So it'll tell you for your community, did you have, how rich was your soil, so to speak, in that dimension? Was it the highest, the deep dark brown, the average, the kind of middle of the road dirt, I guess, and then the lowest, it was the desert. Okay, so you ready to?
Still one.
So, and then I'll just, I'm not going to go into the details there. So here are the, again, the assets, and I'll let you see that again. I do want to point out one thing, interestingly. See this puzzle piece, this 4th one, that's nutrition and sleep? The majority are low across the board in nutrition and sleep. Well, and I think it goes back to Angelo, what you were saying. How many times a week do kids eat dinner with their family? What's the average? What's the typical? Certainly not 3 days a week, you know, if you combine it. Or get a good sleep. I was just in a grade 7 class this morning collecting some data, and I asked them how many of them went to bed at a reasonable time. They said they were tired, and they all said they stayed up too late. And now what this really tells you, what's the amazing thing I find about this, looking at an assets approach, it tells you, first of all, what your strengths are, what's really working, but it actually shines a light on what you can do something about, because each one of these assets is an actionable item. It's something that you can do something about. We know there are things that you can change, that you can work toward. So now we just look at, with the maps again, with the social class in the background. And you see, again, very interesting, I want to point out, I'm going to point out Central Maryhill again, just because. But here's this low SES area that has average on 3 of the 4 dimensions. And but you look up at Anmore Pleasant side, which for whatever reason is it's high in the after-school activities. Would people agree with that? Mm-hmm. That area? Lots of after-school activities? But low in the nutrition and sleep. Or Heritage Mountain, also high in after-school activities. But look at Westwood. I don't know what's happening. I mean, I have to say for me, I feel that you all could interpret these better than I could in terms of trying to think about what would be the, I don't have data to tell you why, but you could make sense of your things. And I will say one thing that we've really done in terms of bringing this to communities is people want to start by looking at the negative. How many of you go right to the desert? Go right, where's the desert in our area? Where I would suggest you always start with the strengths. You know, I talk about resiliency. Go to where you're built, where you're strong, and say, what are we doing that's making that rock? You know, what is it that we're doing in that area? I worked with a school in a community school team in Vancouver, actually, the West End, and they went right to their desert. But they had really positive adult relationships, so they decided as a community to come back together and brainstorm all of the ways that they're already in their community really connecting positively. The adults are connecting to kids. And they realized they'd never really gotten together to talk about all of that and what they were doing that was working so well. So that's my, you know, it's that optimist in me, you know, starting with that idea. So one thing I want to tell you, so do assets actually make a difference in kids' well-being? Well, our data finds that the number of assets that they have, we actually had 5 altogether. We don't map the school ones because kids are mapped by postal code, not by the school they go to, is that the kids, the number of assets you have actually leads to a linear increase in well-being. So that those children who had all 5 assets, they actually, 87% of those children had good well-being, or were thriving, or were medium to high. Now I'm just going to give you a little snapshot before we sort of end here of after-school activities, because I don't know, how many of you work with kids after school or do anything with after-school time? I just wanted to give you a snapshot to start thinking about the after-school hours. I will say I've been working for a number of years. I see Susan back there. I saw her. Yeah, hi. Back years ago, United Way, several years. You remember all this. After-school hours for kids during the elementary school years are such an opportunity to help kids develop and thrive. It's these hours, the 3 to 6, or even after, where our work week, we have not caught up. So what time does the workday end? Never. Oh, never. Okay. There's some moms out there right now. It like never ends. Well, typically, let's say 5. When does school end? 3. Does anyone see any mismatch there between that? There was one time, I love telling this story, there was one time in our history, in last century, in which there was federal funding for after-school time for every child. Every child, federal funding that every child was paid, they had funding to have children in after-school programs. Does anyone know when? World War II. Right, where women had to go to work. Yeah, so they had every child engaged. And we know from research that children engaged in quality after-school time, even if it's not academically focused, even if it's not like math and tutoring, that even just being involved in sports and being in some sort of structure that improves academics. There's just so much interesting work. So let's just look about a little bit of after-school activities. So here's one of the maps that basically shows across Coquitlam where we looked at the proportion of students who participate in organized activities. If it's green, it's 1 or more they do in a week, and if it's red, it's none at all. So you see across, there's tremendous variability across Coquitlam in the number of kids who are in any kind of organized after-school activity. So that really tells you that there's some areas that you right away start thinking, well, why? And what's going on. And I will tell you, interestingly enough, and I've had so many different people who, anyway, I'll just tell you about a research study. So there was a research study that looked at this overscheduling hypothesis. Have you heard about these kids who go from dance to music to soccer to da-da-da? And people always worry, kids are overscheduled, they don't have enough time, it's going to have a negative effect on them. Well, there were some researchers, really well-known researchers, who did something called a meta-analysis. They looked at a number of different studies to see was there negative effects on kids as a result of participating in multiple activities. And the answer was no. There were no negative effects. Now, maybe anyways, I'll just tell you, that's what the data said. Maybe there are other ways they didn't ask, but it seemed to be that kids, certain kids like a lot of activity, and they felt good, and they felt they were developing these important skills. So I think that's an interesting thing, because people worry about that. But it's just something there. But we know that there are kids, so it doesn't seem like too many activities harm kids, but it does seem like no activity harms kids. So that's another important thing to really think about. But what we ask kids, when we ask them, well, I wanted more of a, this is in your handout here, but when we ask kids, now this is so interesting, no one ever asks kids. People automatically think, I was going to ask you this, but now you see the results. People ask kids, what do you want to do? And most people think that kids want to be playing on the computer more. How many of you would have thought kids after school want to be on the computer? I don't know, I would have. And when we ask kids, what do you want to do? What is your wish for after school time? 53% say sports. That was just so surprising to me that so many kids want to be active. I think at this grade 4, they want to play dodgeball, they want to play soccer, they want to go swimming, they want to be with their friends, they want to hang out, they want to be active. It's a time period of really initiative, and I think it's just so fascinating that we haven't thought about that kind of thing in terms of that. Okay. Oh, before I get to this. So now, when I'm ending now, and we're going to get to some of this, I'm going to say, are any of you going? So what? Okay, you have all this data. Really ask yourself, now what? What are we going to do about it? What are we going to do with these data? How are we going to make sense of them? And one thing that we're doing, this is just a bit of a forecasting? What do I say? What's the word? Foreshadowing. So what we're doing at HELP, at the Human Early Learning Partnership, we're developing an MDI toolkit. So this is kind of a snapshot of what the website's going to look like. You'll be able to go to the context of the MDI, understanding the MDI reports, unpacking your data, moving to action, and all sorts of things. And it'll be really important to get stories of what people are doing. So for instance, I'll tell you, interestingly, I told you about the community in the West End. There was a teacher in Vancouver who actually last year got her MDI results, was a grade 3 teacher. When they asked how many adults at your school are important to you, at her school it was 57% of kids said no one. Not one person. And so she said, oh my goodness, that's just so bad. And so she decided she wanted to find out a school in her neighborhood that in the same catchment area that had the same demographics that had a much better, where only like 12% of the kids said no adult was important. And she went and spent the day in that school and during one of her Pro D days to see what was happening in that school. And then came back and shared it with her staff and started to do things with her staff and with her classroom to try and create more connections with kids. And so what we want to do in the toolkit is, it's in its beginning phase, and I know I have my team over here, really capture stories and really be a way that the MDI toolkit isn't going to be us saying like, this is what you should do. You know, it's really about trying to figure out how all of you take these data, make sense of them, and move to action, and so that we can start sharing your stories with other people as we move the MDI across the province. We have Coquitlam, we've done Vancouver, Coquitlam, and Revelstoke, and we have 8 districts coming on board for next year as well. And I just want to end with a quote that's going to be a good segue before we get into this. This is by Seymour Saracen, another really amazing person who really, he actually invented the whole area of community psychology. To the extent that the effort at change identify and meaningfully involve all those who directly or indirectly will be affected by the change, to that extent the effort stands a chance to be successful.